A couple months ago, we determined through all of your votes, as well as my opinion, what the worst iPhone ever is. And today, we're going to be finding the best. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and it's about time we ask the question, what is the best iPhone ever? Right off the bat here, for those of you who want to skip ahead, I'll have some timestamps in the description so you can go straight to the winner. Also, maybe while you're down there, go follow me on Twitter and Instagram so you can stay informed with what I'm up to and what I'm doing more of these types of voting videos so that your input can get in here. Now, obviously, when talking in terms of just the best phone overall, the iPhone XS Max reigns supreme. It's the best iPhone on the market right now, as it's the newest. But today we're kind of looking past that and instead focusing on the impact and success of past iPhones, as opposed to just which is the fastest and has the best camera. Which phones brought the most changes? How long did they last? All these factors will come into play when finding the best iPhone. Due to how new the iPhone XR and XS are, I think it's really too early to judge them, and so they will be unfortunately exempt from this video. In about a year we'll have a better idea of how they fared, so maybe we'll revisit it then. But for now, we're looking at the first iPhone all the way to the iPhone X, and we're gonna determine which is the best. I'm gonna go over every single option and choose the ones I believe to be real contenders. And at the end of the video, I will choose a winner and compare that winner to what you guys thought on both Twitter and the community tab of my YouTube channel. Also, if you don't want to be spoiled, don't scroll down to the comments, just a heads up. And with that, let's get into this. Let's start where this all started. The original iPhone from 2007. It's unbelievable how much this single device impacted and revolutionized the market, and yet here we are now with literally every single person having a smartphone in their pocket at all times. The iPhone was really something special, and while I think it being the first of its kind does leave it mostly void of criticism, it did have its setbacks that keeps it from being the best iPhone ever. It didn't have a competitive price point. It lacked 3G network capabilities. The build quality wasn't very good, all things considered, and it's unfortunate that there were problems with it because I think this probably should have been the phone to beat. So the first iPhone was amazing, don't get me wrong, but I don't think we can call it the best. Luckily, all these issues in the first iPhone were fixed in the next iteration, the 2008 iPhone 3G. It had 3G and a much better price point that made it more appealing to potential buyers. That said, it also degraded the iPhone from an aluminum body to a plastic one. Even if the aluminum wasn't very good in the first place, I would say plastic is worse, and the phone brought nearly nothing except for the aforementioned improvements. Not to mention it's as slow as molasses on its latest update, iOS 4. For the time, the iPhone 3G was a success, but with perfect hindsight, we can see that it really didn't bring a whole lot to even consider it good. 2009, the iPhone 3GS. This phone brought much better speeds and a much better camera, a typical S-line upgrade that we've become accustomed to. This phone was actually the first one to record video, which is cool, and it ran really well on each iOS version it received up to iOS 6. The 3GS is one of the most solid, well-rounded iPhones in my opinion, but it isn't exciting. There really weren't any big name features, and so it's with some regret I have to say, as much as I love this phone, it can't be considered the best. Although I would say that it could be considered great. 2010, the iPhone 4. Where do I even start with this phone? It brought so much, being the biggest redesign in the iPhone line until the iPhone X, and overall just being a masterpiece. You could tell Steve Jobs really loved this phone when he announced it, and for good reason. It was a beautiful device. We had a new stainless steel frame and glass back, a far cry from the plastic of a year prior. This design has held up amazingly well, especially considering the iPhone X switched back to it last year. We got the first ever Retina display, and holy cow, it looked amazing compared to the iPhone 3GS and literally every other smartphone at the time. Apple was so ahead of the game in 2010 it wasn't even close, and this phone really cemented that fact. But as much as the iPhone 4 brought, it wasn't perfect. Antenna gate was a thing. Basically, if you covered the antennas with your hand, you would drop calls, which was a pain and a major design flaw. And of course, the iPhone 4 was supported all the way to iOS 7, which is extremely slow on this device. In all fairness, it did speed up significantly with 7.1, but that damage was already done, and the 4 has been heavily regarded as a slow mess since the update. Despite the missteps Apple made with the iPhone 4, it's still hard to argue that it isn't not only one of the best iPhones, but best smartphones in general. 2011, the iPhone 4S. The 4S was your typical S-line upgrade for the most part, faster speeds, better camera, and in this case Siri. The 4S was really solid. Oh my gosh. Alrighty, the 4S was really solid at launch, but it was still pretty small and didn't bring a whole lot new to the table. It also has aged the worst of basically any iPhone, being practically unusable on iOS 9.3.5. The 4S unfortunately is not one of the best iPhones, but probably one of the worst, simply for how poorly it's aged. I actually lived with the 4S for an entire week, by the way, because I'm crazy, so if you want to see that, there'll be a link in the description below. 2012, the iPhone 5. The iPhone 5 was the last Steve Jobs era iPhone, as while he had passed on by its release, it still held his input for the design and carried the last classic iteration of software we saw, iOS 6. The phone was crazy fast with a huge upgrade over the 4S, doubling its RAM, and it was just a pleasure to use. The size was perfect for a lot of people, and to this day it's one of the lightest iPhones we've ever seen. The design was so good, Apple reused it with both the 5S and 4 years later with the SE. Furthermore, the iPhone 5 felt fast on every single version of iOS it received. That's seriously impressive, and it's fair to say this is one of the best iPhones Apple has ever made. 2013, the iPhone 5C. Where do I even start with this phone? It was terrible, all things considered. I mean, okay, it ran well, and if you had one, you probably liked it as it wasn't a bad phone, but literally the only reason that it was even okay was because it was literally just the iPhone 5 in a cheaper plastic shell. This was a mess of a phone, and at only $100 less than the 5S, there was literally no reason to buy the 5C. I've talked enough about this phone in the past. This is definitely one of the worst iPhones ever created, and is probably the most pointless. Also 2013, we got the iPhone 5S. This phone made a bigger impact on the smartphone world than I think anyone realized at the time, with a few main upgrades that really mattered. Touch ID for one, as it completely changed the way everybody handled smartphone security, and then the A7 chipset. The A7 had the first 64-bit architecture in a smartphone, and while that might sound meaningless, let me assure you this was a huge deal and pushed Android manufacturers into a frenzy to try to match it. The iPhone 5S was forward-thinking in every way imaginable. Link to a video on that in the description below, by the way, and it has aged the best of any iPhone ever by far, with it still being updatable to iOS 12 right now. That's right, this phone from 2013 can do almost everything the newest iPhone XS can do. That's absolutely insane, and Apple deserves huge props for creating such a stacked device that's been able to last so darn long. The iPhone 5S is without a doubt one of the best iPhones ever. 2014, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. Apple had been killing it with the iPhone 5 and 5S, and the 6 seemed to continue that trend. We had two size options, both being much bigger than any iPhone we had ever seen, which capitalized on the then rising phablet trend. The phones brought a much needed refresh to the iPhone line, and the sales reflected that. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus are the best selling smartphones ever, with over 220 million units shipped. That's an insane number, and it is completely unmatched by any other modern device. While the 6 was a massive success back then, with perfect hindsight we can see that it was a bit of a mess. Bendgate of course was a thing, and this resulted in not only bending but touch disease, as well as a variety of other issues. The phone also didn't bring hardly anything new other than the size, and so for me I would consider it to be one of the worst iPhones Apple has ever done, simply because they could have made it so much better. 2015, the iPhone 6S and 6S Plus. These phones looked essentially the same as the iPhone 6, but they brought some extremely necessary additions. The most important was the higher grade aluminum that greatly increased the durability so the phones no longer would bend. We also had a huge jump in performance, and in the camera, this is about as good of an S-line upgrade as they come. We also got 3D Touch, a headphone jack, and the still very good second generation Touch ID. This was a great phone, and perhaps even one of the best. Early 2016, the iPhone SE. There was a small portion of the market that felt ostracized by the bigger iPhones. There hadn't been a small one in about 2.5 years at this point, and that last phone was the 5S. The SE served to appeal to these customers, and it did. The SE had the same body as the 5S, but with the internals of the 6S. It was a great little phone, and it came at an even better little price. Even today, the SE is one of the best budget options out there, but it isn't one of the best iPhones. While it was great for what it was, the SE used an old design and brought nothing new. I love the SE, but it isn't the best iPhone ever. Late 2016, the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. This was a bit of a polarizing release. The iPhone 7 removed the headphone jack, and it's easy to say people weren't especially impressed. The phone looked too similar to the iPhone 6 to be considered much of a redesign, and while it brought water resistance and the A10 chip and the first secondary camera lens, it just wasn't unique enough for people to get behind it. Unfortunately, there is no way to consider this phone to be one of the best. 2017, the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus. These phones were meant to be cheaper options for those who weren't ready to give up the home button, and they were actually pretty good for what they were. In fact, I've called them massively underrated in the past. The iPhone 8 brought a glass back, wireless charging, a better camera, and so on, but it was all overshadowed by its bigger and better brother, which we'll talk about right now. Also in 2017, the iPhone 10. We're quite early in the life of the iPhone 10, but I think it's fair to say this is one of the best phones we have ever seen. It had the biggest redesign of any iPhone ever, or at least since the 4. We've done away with the home button and have a nearly bezel-less display, only intruded by a notch that holds Apple's very cool Face ID technology. Love it or hate it, it's hard to argue that the iPhone 10 is one of Apple's best phones ever to be released. Plus, it brought Animoji, and we all know how important Animoji is. And that's about every single iPhone eligible to be considered the best. Again, we aren't going to be looking at either the XS or the XR, as in my opinion they're too new and can't really be looked at objectively. And so with that, we have our winners of round 1, the iPhone 4, 5, 5S, 6S, and 10. These phones all qualify to be potentially the best iPhone ever. That's actually a large amount of phones, and I think it's just a testament to how good Apple has been over the years, at least sometimes, and even if you're about as anti-Apple as they come, you have to admit Apple tends to do more phones right than they do wrong. But we can only have one winner, and so let's knock out the easiest first. The iPhone 6S is a good phone. Actually, I'd argue that it's a great phone, and it had a lot of support in the votes, which I'll show in a bit. What's impressive is that this wasn't actually an option, but people wrote it in the comments a lot, and I couldn't exactly ignore it. I had a other option that you could choose, and it got more votes than I expected it to. The fact is, there can only be so many iPhones that can be considered the best, and I don't really think the 6S stands up to the rest of them. It's an amazing phone, but it's missing the wow factor. It did bring a lot to iPhones in general and has helped the evolution greatly, but at the end of the day, it was just what the iPhone 6 should have been, and it didn't bring anything huge. There were no big name features, and I think that's something you need to have to be considered the best. So now we have the iPhone 4, 5, 5S, and 10, and this is where it gets a bit hard, as all of these phones are great for their own individual reasons. The 4, 5, and 10 were all redesigns. That's a bonus for them, although the 5 was probably the weakest redesign in the bunch, as it did look different but not massively different from the 4. The 5S also had a redesign, but in software only, and you can't discount the importance of iOS 7. Oh man, this is pretty hard. I'm finding it extremely difficult to pick a winner. Each phone has a legitimately good reason to be the best, but let's knock off 2 more phones here. The iPhone 5 has one of the most solid designs ever in a piece of technology, to the point that Apple was selling a phone with the same body as the 5 up until late 2018, but that's really all the iPhone 5 brought. Sure, it was a bit faster than the 4S, and yes, it had iOS 6, which is iconic, but when it comes to support, it was outdone by the 5S, and in terms of a major redesign, the iPhone 4 and 10 have it beat. I've said before the iPhone 5 is what an iPhone should be, and I stand by that. It was an amazing phone, and one that stayed that way throughout its entire life, but as good as it isn't the best, and neither is the iPhone 4. Now, the iPhone 4 is a great phone, absolutely one of the best, and if you think it is the best, I definitely won't argue with you. I think that's valid, but it's unbearable on iOS 7, at least to me, and I'd say that just kind of ruins it for me. While the iPhone 4 was a huge redesign, I don't know if it's as big as the iPhone 10s, so I think it deserves to get knocked out sooner. Also, AntennaGate happened, and that was a serious oversight on Apple's part. The iPhone 4 was my first iPhone, and believe it or not, I actually had an Android before that. But as much as this phone means to me, it isn't the best iPhone ever. Alright, now we're down to the iPhone 5S and the iPhone 10. To be honest, I really didn't think that these would be the finalists when I started doing all of this, but after writing out the pros and cons of each iPhone, I realized that these two do seem to be the best of what Apple's come up with over the years. The iPhone 10 was the largest redesign we've ever seen, and probably ever will see. easy. Gone is the home button, and that's something no one saw coming even just a few years ago. When I first got the iPhone 10, if you watch my old reviews, I mentioned that it's like holding the future in your hand, and it is. The iPhone 10's beautiful OLED panel mixed with the stainless steel and glass back makes it easily the most premium feeling phone of 2017, and it still holds up today with the XS having the same body. You might cry about the notch, but the notch has been replicated on nearly every Android phone in 2018 for a reason. It was a good design choice, although most of the Android phones trying to use it don't understand that it doesn't look good when you still have a chin. The A11 chip was a beast, the camera was great, and literally almost everything about the iPhone 10 was perfect. It was the ultimate upgrade, and the impact of it can't be understated. But the iPhone 5S is better. The iPhone 10 deserves at least second place for sure, and if you personally think it should be first, I get it. But in my opinion, it's just too new for us to have a good understanding of how it really compares. We've had over 5 years of the 5S to analyze it and see how it's aged, but the iPhone 10 is only a year old, and as such, it's really hard to say whether or not it's a better phone than the 5S, because we really don't know whether or not that it will be. The 10's life isn't over, but the 5S's is coming to an end. Personally, I think the 10 may end up being better than the 5S, but again, we won't really know until another few years down the road. The iPhone 5S was 64-bit. Again, this is the first smartphone that ever did it. It had Touch ID, which set the standard for mobile security. It brought iOS 7, the first and only overhaul of iOS that pushed Apple forward into the future. And of course, with the iPhone 5S, we've had over 5 years of full consistent support, something that's never been done before. It wasn't a massive leap forward like the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 10, but it doesn't need to be, and for what it is, I think it's done an amazing job. The 5S just doesn't really have any flaws, and as such, I think it belongs at the top of the iPhone tower without a doubt. And so here it is, my opinion. The 5S is the best iPhone. But what did you all think? Let's turn to the Twitter poll first. With the least amount of votes, we have the iPhone 4 at 10%. This was a bit surprising to me, as I personally saw it as more important than the iPhone 5. Speaking of which, coming in at 20%, we have the iPhone 5. At 26%, we have the iPhone 10, and finally with 44% of the vote, we have the iPhone 5S, the clear winner. So you guys basically agree with me. You had the iPhone 5 quite a bit higher than I put it, but generally I think we can get along here, and that's always nice to see. Having a popular opinion usually means less dislikes. Okay, let's look at the YouTube poll. First off, we got over 22,000 votes, which is insane, as well as over 1,400 comments. Apparently people are pretty passionate about this. At the bottom of the vote, we have the iPhone 5 with only 6%. That's a stark contrast to the Twitter vote, that's for sure. Moving up, we have the iPhone 4 at 9%, and then we have Other at 12%. It's hard to gauge what people are voting for when they chose Other, but I think most people have the iPhone's success in mind, at least according to the comments, which of course I threw into consideration, but overall disregarded as I don't think it did enough to be the best. Still an interesting pick regardless though, and I can see why people would like the iPhone's success. In second place, we have, you guessed it, the iPhone 10 at 18%. This leaves the iPhone 5S as the overwhelming winner with 55% of the vote. That's actually a crazy large amount, and much more definitive than what people were saying on Twitter, as things over there were a little bit closer. So all of our opinions mostly matched up, and that's pretty rare on YouTube. There were a ton of interesting comments. Unfortunately, I didn't read them all, as there were literally over 1,400, and while I'd love to share a few, today we are kind of running out of time, but I will answer one that stood out to me. The most prominent issue with me calling the 5S the best iPhone when I was writing this is that it didn't really have any crazy redesign. I mean, it did on the software side, but the hardware really didn't look any different than the iPhone 5. And Brian here says, the 4 or the 10 make the most sense. They were both revolutionary redesigns to the phones. The others, while all necessary in the evolution of the iPhone, didn't feel like the massive leap forward that the iPhone 4 and 10 made. This is a super valid point. My problem is with the iPhone 4 is that it was kind of ruined down the road. If it had stayed in the state that it was at launch, I think it would be easily the best iPhone, but iOS 7 kind of ruined things. And again, it's completely fair to call the iPhone 10 the best iPhone, but I think it's just too new at the moment. If we check back in a couple years, we might be able to confirm that it really is the best, but at the moment, I think the 5S still holds the crown. And with that, I think it's finally about time we close out this video. The iPhone 5S is the best iPhone out there right now, but I can't wait for Apple to release something even better. If you enjoyed this video, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this, as I put a lot of effort into this video. I really want to get it right. website. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram if you want to keep up, direct links below. And with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.